Platform video games have come a long way since their origin. The first ever game you can recall was back in 1980 with Space Panic, but most likely you remember Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong introduced to us Mario, which is probably the most famous video game character who ever lived, if you want to say it that way. By 1988, Nintendo had created the most important franchise in video game history, Super Mario Bros. Throughout history, Mario has had a lot of games, but in this occasion, I'm only going to talk about Super Mario Bros. 3. Now you gotta remember that back in 1988, this was probably the most difficult game that was out there, not to mention Zelda 2 or the original Zelda. Let's forget about nostalgia for a while, and come all the way back to this decade.
Super Meat Boy!
Super Meat Boy is a game that was developed in 2010 after its original Flash version released on Newgrounds in 2008. This game is much like Mario Bros. 3. Precisely because it's a platform game which also includes extreme difficulties. It even won an award in 2010 as being the most difficult game that was released that year. Now the story is simple. You're playing as Meat Boy, a box-shaped piece of meat who's trying to rescue his girlfriend, Bandage Girl, from his arch-enemy, Dr. Fetus. This is much like Mario, who's trying to rescue Princess Peach from Bowser. To start off, what's curious about this game is the graphics and the music, which both include the traditional 8-bit way of making video games. The funny thing is, Super Meat Boy was developed by only 2 guys. Now these guys I consider as indie developers, which I will explain in a second. Anyway, these guys are trying to bring back the old feel in video games in the 80s. They describe Super Meat Boy as a big throwback to a lot of super hardcore NES classics like Ghosts and Goblins, Mega Man, and the Japanese version of Super Mario Bros. 2, with the plot written as a mashup of every video game story from the early 90s. Each level lasts around 30 seconds, which is complemented by an infinite amount of lives. To reach the end of the level, you're supposed to rescue Bandage Girl, but obviously you don't, because Dr. Fetus grabs her as soon as you do. With a total of 6 worlds and over 200 platforms, you run around in each level, literally sticking to the walls, trying to dodge obstacles that can vary from saws, to salt pits, to fire, to lava, even a few random enemies which kinda look like Pokemon. Another similarity between these two games is to reach the boss levels. Now in Mario, you're supposed to complete each level before you can reach the boss castle. However, in some of the worlds, because of how it's arranged, you can actually skip some of the levels. Now in Super Meat Boy, in each world it only asks 17 out of the 20 levels that are in the game, or that world at the moment, to reach the boss. The only difference between these two bosses is that in Super Meat Boy, it's not a physical character you have to defeat, but more of a task. It's kind of like outrunning the level, or kind of like winning a race. As for increased difficulties in both of these games, in Super Meat Boy, each world has a light and dark side to it. You start off in the light side, but you need to unlock the dark side so you can continue on with the game. To do so, you need to finish each stage under the par time, and be patient, because you're gonna have to repeat the levels until you get it right. Once you're here, try not to get pissed off, because these levels are 10 times as hard as their counterpart. Mario Bros. 3 on the other hand, gets harder as you progress, with easy stages at the start like setting the VCR and then building one from scratch. On either game, expect to die several times. Another lookalike feature is finding secret areas hidden within the worlds. Super Meat Boy has wormholes that will literally warp you to the past. A pixelated 8-bit zone with the same elements as the normal ones. You can obtain new characters to play as if you finish these levels. Super Mario has a different way to finding secrets. Although both of them are pretty well hidden, in this game you have to check every possible corner to find from coins to extra lives and even items that will help you on your journey. A well-known added level is the famous White Ship, which only appears if you meet specific requirements. I mean, people must have had way too much time to figure this out, especially 20 years ago when you couldn't just Google everything. Speaking of secrets, I mentioned how you could obtain characters on Super Meat Boy. They can actually help you finish some levels if you get stuck or you just want to play differently. Mario Bros has power-ups that will make it easier to get past some areas in the game. Like if you get a mushroom, you'll grow, making you break blocks and whatnot. You can even find a Tanuki suit, a random raccoon dog from Japan, that can be used to turn you into stone. You can start seeing how the developers try to go back to the game style of this era. Way back in the 80s, Nintendo was the first company to change the way games were viewed, played, and enjoyed. Now we see the same thing happening with new independent creators. I mentioned earlier that I would explain what an indie developer is. These guys are the ones that take games seriously and aren't in the industry for the money. They're changing the way we play games nowadays. Instead of wanting to make a game that's easy to finish, has the latest graphics, and a complex storyline that sometimes you can't even follow, they're actually doing the opposite. Because of this, major game developers think they are a waste of time, giving them less of a chance of actually making the games. Despite this, indie developers fund themselves through other means, like Kickstarter for example, a platform where you donate certain amounts of money in exchange for whatever the funder is giving out. The Behemoth, Team Meat, Cat and Fox Studios, Mojang, Playdead, and currently Yacht Club Games all have opted to follow this path and have been successfully praised by critics and fans. After all, they laughed at Miyamoto when he came up with the whole rescuing a princess with a plumber idea. He believed that a game must have true innovation and meaning, not just a big seller. Nowadays, the only way to do so is by not following the standard, just like Mr. Miyamoto did. They may not be the most famous games you've ever seen, but because of their format, appeal to innovation, and overall simplicity, even non-gamers have started to notice them. Particularly because of the lower price compared to a $60 major release, which sometimes ends up being a shitty game. In the end, what people want is to have fun and believe the money they spent was worth it, even if the game costs 5 times less. This movement is truly making people reevaluate the way they play video games. To finish off my rant, it's really up to you if you find these games entertaining, because as with everything, everybody's opinion is different. But the fact is, taking elements from old 80s games and turning them into new cutting-edge masterpieces is the improved way of creating games for indie developers, and in the end, will make major companies focus and not continue to exploit franchises, graphics, and meaningless stories. The 80s set the standards high, but these guys figured out a way to match and revamp.